Hello and welcome, my friends, to this webinar on AI. We are sending live from our studios in Stockholm. My name is Martin, and I am a senior trainer here at APIS. Today, I'm very proud to present the first in a series of webinars on AI, artificial intelligence. In a little while, just a few minutes, I promise you, I'm going to let our main act onto the stage, Mr. Manoj Chiba from Johannesburg, who's going to tell us about AI. And this is the first installment in a series of AI webinars. If you don't know so much about APIS, we are one of the world's top deliverers of technical training within telecommunications and data communications. Those two things are kind of floating together these days, aren't they? So we have a lot of training on 5G and SDN and NFV virtualization, all these things. There is a lot of AI in there as well, and I'm quite sure Manoj is going to mention 5G at least once or twice during his talk. So AI is mentioned a lot in there, and I can tell you that I've been spending the last couple of days writing an article on 6G, researching what there is to know about it. And there is a lot written about AI within the context of 6G as well. So it is not a topic that is dying out, I promise you. We even have a course delivered by Mr. Chiba, which is AI for Telecoms. So that's one of in our standard portfolio of courses, so to speak. Our courses come in classroom format, normal classroom, but also live online, just like you're watching me right now, where you see a teacher live, you can ask questions and so on. And we also have a recorded version of all our courses, which is self-paced, where you can take it wherever you want at whatever time you want, of course. All right. So, without further ado, I welcome onto stage Manoj Chiba. Hello there. How are you?
Hey, good in yourself, Martin.
Good. You're going to talk to us about AI for a little while. We have an hour set for this. I'm starting things off here. I have a few introductory questions to you. I'm very curious about this, so I will start off sort of taking this chance to ask them to you myself, and then I'm actually going to go off stage to monitor the Q&A, because there's a questions and answers function in this meeting as well. You find it usually along the top of your screen. There's a little cartoon bubble with a question mark in it. If you click that, you come to the Q&A function, and you can ask questions there. And then I can bring them up during the talk or towards the end of this hour to Manoj, and he'll be able to answer them. I won't promise that he'll be able to answer all of them. It kind of depends on how many we get, of course. But Manoj, tell me a little bit, what is it that led you to this AI career? What made you interested in this to begin with?
So, Martin, thank you. I think it's quite serendipitous that I am where I am. I've taken the time over many, many years to really get an understanding of what this world of artificial intelligence is. I think it's hit a hype trend right now where we are in the world over the last 4 to 5 years specifically, and I think it's slowly ramping up as we're starting to see many organizations really starting to take advantage of this thing called artificial intelligence. So just to prove to everyone that I am real, I can lift my hands up, I can move them. I'm not a robot speaking to you from South Africa at the moment. But it was serendipitous, Martin. To answer the question quite simply, it was serendipitous. I needed to choose what was I going to study when I finished off school at a university, and I so happened to end up studying, mathematics and statistics, which to a large extent is dealing with the data that you and I can keep collecting right now. And when you spoke about 6G specifically right now, my head is still in 5G. And what are some of the big, implications of 5G on our world of data? And to be clear, the first sort of AI piece that I built was probably around 1999, When I say, built it, Martin, I had many friends studying computer science, the ability to learn how to code. And I think, like many people, when you go to university, you make, lots of new friends that are studying different things. And often what happens is that you end up learning more about what your friends are studying than what you were studying, or supposed to be, studying at the same time. So I think it was really just getting together, being able to say, how and why. So at the core of it, Martin, it was very serendipitous. I didn't set out to become an AI specialist. I didn't set out to become a machine learning specialist, and all of these terms, which I'm going to, sort of debunk. But there's always one question at the back of my mind that really bothered me, and I think it keeps me up at night, is so what? So what does all of this mean for, I call it three different levels. The first level being a country level. What does it mean for, different countries, different governments specifically? And then what really keeps it going for an organizational level as well? And then also, what is the impact, or what effect does it have on you and me as an example? And those are the questions that I keep wondering about and I keep thinking about. It's the so what. So we can have all of this, we can have lots of data, but really, how does this all come together? And and as I talk about this background, and I talk about it quite serendipitously, I took, if I can say it, Martin, I took advantage of any given opportunity that I had. I never said no, and I was always learning and wanting to learn all the time. I always wanted to learn new things. And I think it all boils down to the word curiosity from my perspective. Because what is curiosity? The ability to say, what don't I understand and what do I want to understand? But it's the so what and the curiosity that really got me together with a foundation of understanding how to analyze data that really got me into this field of artificial intelligence. And I'm probably going to give my age away, but in 1999, I built my first recommendation engine. The recommendation engine, the only problem way back in 1999 was that we didn't have the computing or the technological power to be able to really, deploy it, as we call it now in the technology world, but really to use it. So that's where I come from, roughly about 20, 21 years of experience, and often being playing at the intersection of what is the value? Value for countries, value for organizations, and value for us as individuals as well in this world of artificial intelligence. And so putting, right in front and center specifically for me to understand how and what value can we get out of this here. So that's just a little bit of background from where I sit. And I think we can all appreciate, what we've been talking about, let's call it for the last 18 to 24 months or 18 months at least, with coronavirus, where we're starting to see a lot of this popping up. It's given us the opportunity, Martin, to connect in this forum as well, and really be able to connect with people at a global level, the ability to learn from each other. I think irrespective of where I sit, going into winter in South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa specifically, and interacting with you out in Stockholm, is really for me an interesting place and a world that is rapidly changing and a world that is rapidly, moving at a pace that many of us can't keep up with. I say that on the back of us understanding what are the core ingredients that we need to start understanding, as we start talking about artificial intelligence there, Martin.
I see. I can definitely hear where your excitement comes from about this, but because I was curious about
Yeah.
that, where you came from, what your excitement about this is.
Yeah.
I th I think I'm going to do this. I would like you, because you mentioned AI, of course, and you mentioned machine learning. You mentioned the word debunk somewhere in there, and there is this confusion about terminology. It's always, and,
Yeah.
and you kind of pretend you just go along and say, yeah, sure, AI, but then maybe you mean completely different things with AI.
Yeah.
I know I've met different people who mean different things with AI specifically. So I was wondering if you could just start off by giving us sort of a definition of this AI. There's this machine learning that comes in. When I read stuff, AI and ML quite often go together. It just says AI/ML, and you wonder,
Yeah.
so do you need both, or what's the difference? Also, I've also been in this business for roughly 20 years, and I'm an engineer. And back then, I know I've seen neural network. That was a term that
Yeah.
existed quite some time back and seems sort of peripheral to this. So I was wondering, is it? So if you could clear out the terminology And then I was just curious if you could go on after that and just tell us, because I know there are business people looking at this. The normal attendee to this webinar is a person working at a company somewhere, and the big question is, what do companies get from this? Why is there such a big interest, not just from a personal level, because of course that's interesting. There's this whole sci-fi sort of teaser about AI, but mainly,
Yeah.
if you could sort of go into that direction and tell us what do corporations gain from using AI? Is that okay? So,
Yeah,
so clear out
100%.
the terminology, and then just go on, tell us what corporations need AI for. I will actually go off and check questions now, and I will come back in a little while. Is that okay, Manoj?
Perfect. Let's
All
go for
right.
it, Martin. Great. So I think, Martin, you touch on a point that always gets me. It's we sit in meetings, well, now virtually predominantly, but we often sit in these business meetings. We sit and speak to people and around the dinner table, wherever it may be, and we generally throw out terms without fully understanding, what do they really mean? Or, either we don't know what it really means, or when we use it, I don't want to be the person in the room that says, hold on, what does that truly mean? And I always say this to everyone that I speak to, and I speak to many thousands of people every year, is always go back down to the definition. Because I think artificial intelligence, in its big hype that's really out there, in a massive trend that's really out there, both from a business perspective, and I'll talk a bit about that shortly, is what is artificial intelligence? Like you said, you'll see AI/ML. I want to take a more pragmatic view of it. And I want to take the view that artificial intelligence is actually just an umbrella term. It's an umbrella term that really incorporates all of these words and terms that you and I often speak about, that we often hear about as well, which includes things like machine learning, natural language processing, some expert systems, robotics, vision, speech, and all of those things that we talk about, the neural networks, the big data. So all artificial intelligence really is, from my perspective, and I think this is where we all really are coalescing from an understanding of what AI is that it's an umbrella term. Let's just think about that, because when it's an umbrella term, it means that there's no difference between, or there's no similarity between AI and ML. It's just that ML is a component of artificial intelligence. So if we think about this from an equation perspective, and I like to use equations specifically when we're talking about business. Business, when we try to calculate something like profit is equal to revenue minus cost. I mean, in a very basic manner from a revenue perspective, is that artificial intelligence is equal to machine learning, deep learning, which has all of these components of neural networks. So artificial intelligence, from my perspective, is really just an overarching term or an umbrella term specifically. And I think that's from a technical capability or technical understanding. So when I see things like AI/ML, I often wonder, how and why are you mixing up the terms? Because the one is actually a component of it. In other words, that machine learning is a component of artificial intelligence. So just starting there is that we should start thinking about artificial intelligence as an umbrella term. But that's all good. I think, Martin, what we must appreciate here is, what is the business definition of artificial intelligence? And for me, it's really, that it's computer-based systems. So systems that use computers really to perform, enhance, or transform your business activities by simulating human behavior. And that's where the artificial part of the word AI really comes from. It's really about simulating human behavior and mimicking human behavior to a large extent. Now, I'll debunk and I'll unpack that shortly, because we often get confused from the sci-fi movies that you and I talk about now, or that you mentioned, specifically in understanding, that our robot's going to take over the world, take over our jobs. I'll briefly touch on that as well. But one of the things here is that by simulating human behavior, a business definition of artificial intelligence really has got the aim of improving business efficiency or effectiveness. Now, whenever we think about the organization, their primary drivers to why we adopt or adapt any new systems or ways of doing things. And primarily where we're seeing artificial intelligence at the moment is, how does that increase our efficiency or efficacy as an organization? And I say this because when we start talking about AI in the business context specifically, what we really need to start thinking about is, what is it? It's simply an umbrella term that incorporates machine learning, deep learning, neural networks, all of those subcomponents of things that you really hear about. That's the first point. But the second point is, what does it mean for business? What does it mean for you and I specifically sitting in our organizations? For me, it really just means that how can we enhance our efficiency or efficacy as an organization? Now, we hear this term and we often think that, listen, our machine's really going to take over the world. I think you and I must be completely pragmatic with each other. Is that to complicate matters worse from a definitional perspective, what we've been able to do was split out artificial intelligence. We split out artificial intelligence into two components. The first component is artificial narrow intelligence, and the other one is artificial general intelligence. When anyone often talks about artificial intelligence, they often think about artificial general intelligence. In other words, where computer-based systems can do anything that you and I can do. My favorite analogy is, and I like this analogy because I think it's quite simplistic in its ability to truly understand why we're very far away from artificial general intelligence. It's just thinking about an airline pilot. An airline pilot as an individual can drive a car to be able to get to the airport, and then he can then also, or she can, as a single individual, fly an aeroplane as well. However, that's what artificial general intelligence is. Our systems have not got to that stage where we can do almost two different things, driving a car and flying an aeroplane all together. And so we must be clear that the world that you and I sit in right now is what I'd like to think about as artificial narrow intelligence. Where the real confusion comes in from an artificial intelligence perspective that uses machine learning, neural networks, and deep learning, and all of those nice things, is that we often think about the self-driving car. Now, the self-driving car, which is really, something that's big in the world right now and will probably become ubiquitous over the next 10, 15, even 20 years globally. What we do see is that that's what we term as narrow intelligence, because whatever that car is doing, it's only being built for the car. In other words, all the intelligence, the artificial intelligence that's being built out at the moment is to drive a car. You can't copy and paste that exact same code and let it fly an aeroplane. So I think what we must be clear about is just to that point of what is AI to a large extent. It's quite simply an umbrella term for things such as machine learning, and then we can see deep learning in there. An AI specialist, as an individual that specializes in artificial intelligence, will know the components, those components about how do I do machine learning, how do I do deep learning, all based on a critical ingredient. Now, it's a pity that you can't see my full body, but I'm a big guy. Let me be clear, I'm a big guy. And so I'm going to use a food analogy, because I think the food analogy is something that will stick with any of us here. Let's imagine we're trying to bake a cake here. One of the most critical ingredients, and we can have debates around this, but one of the most critical ingredients in baking a cake is flour. In our case, when we talk about AI, the most basic ingredient that you and I need is this thing called data. The ability to collect data in different shapes and different forms. And that different data comes in different, when I talk about different shapes and forms, it comes in different types. We get data in the form of numbers, we get data in the form of words, we get data in the form of voice, what I'm doing right now. And then lastly, we get data in the form of images as well. So that's where we've got to really start thinking about how do I bring these four different types of data broadly all together to be able to start thinking about how AI really works. Now, when we bring all of those pieces of data together, that's where we all sit and think about, okay, what's the intelligence that can come out of it? To be able to extract that intelligence that comes out of all of that different types of data, we require machine learning, where we first start off by telling a machine, that if I see, let's think of the self-driving car, if I see a dog, stop. Or if I see a cat, stop. We've got to train those systems. So that's what we call supervised learning in this whole game. And then we've got to get the machine to learn by itself when it sees something like a dog or something like a cat, as an example. The reason I'm mentioning this here is because part of the definition is to be able to start digging one level deeper. In the case of you and I sitting in the business or the organization specifically, the ability to extract value out of artificial intelligence fundamentally is fundamentally based upon us understanding the data that we have access to. Now, data as a critical ingredient into building artificial intelligence has always been something that many organizations have grappled with. When I say grappled with it, it's, this term called big data. And the reason I'm going back to that stage of what big data is, and then I'll get back into the organization sense, is that as a critical ingredient, data needs to be there. And when people started talking about big data, they thought they needed lots of data. I would much prefer that we start defining data as a core ingredient into artificial intelligence outside of the amount or how much data you have in terms of size. I don't think it's the size of data that matters. It's the sufficiency of data that really matters here. And when I think about the sufficiency of data, it's less about how much terabytes, petabytes of data that you have, but rather how much data do you have that comes in different forms. Think about you and I. We are multidimensional beings. In other words, we're made up of different things. Our histories, our education, the way we think, the way we work, the people we interact with, and we all pull it together in what we call human intelligence. But the critical component here is that we're asking machines to do this now. And those machines are the same machines that you and I are interacting on right now, which is our computers, which have got fast processing speeds. So just to think about that from an organizational perspective, the first most critical ingredient that you need for artificial intelligence is data. Now, what value does this artificial intelligence add to organizations such as us? And I'll give you a few sort of enablers specifically that we know what artificial intelligence can be, but it's all based and premised on what is the business definition of AI. And I'd loop back to that specifically to say that what it really boils down to is how do we increase organizational efficiency and how do we increase organizational efficacy, specifically when we start talking about this here. But why have we seen this big rise, Martin? I think we haven't touched on that. Because the first things that we must understand is that there is real business value. What that business value really points down to is how do we start getting growth? Every organization in any industry is under hyper competition, as I would like to call it. In other words, what we have is many organizations competing for this very same piece of the pie to a large extent. But how is AI really helping us? And that should be the question that we should be asking ourselves to a large extent. So what we're seeing is that artificial intelligence can help us drive what we call top-line growth. What is that top-line growth or revenue growth that we can start seeing is really around understanding how can we get revenue into the organization. That's the top-line growth when we think about AI. The second one is obviously around the one big major trend that sits out there as we speak right now is around customer experience. Artificial intelligence specifically can help us achieve better customer experience than we've often had. The most simplest explanation of a customer experience is about a 24 by 7, so 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, ability to have someone to answer customer queries and be able to deliver good customer service. You and I would have interacted with this, and I know it's somewhat gimmicky to a large extent. In other words, when I talk about gimmicky, it's a tool that pops up on the side of websites when you visit them, but chatbots. Chatbots fundamentally have been proven to really increase the customer experience of a base. Now, let's be clear. If you improve your customer experience, if we're talking about the B2C environment specifically, you often end up with what we call customer retention as well. And then we also have this thing called service delivery on the other side of that second point from a driver's perspective of what we're seeing really why AI is being adopted, is also from a service delivery. I'm one of those people that, I forgot to do something, make a phone call during the day. How can I still solve my problem at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning? And we often see that's how people deal with it. So I can get service delivery very quick, where it was very difficult to a large extent before. Then we've got to think about the next benefit of artificial intelligence in the business space specifically, is around bottom line cost savings. Now, I want to juxtapose that with top line revenue growth, is because when we talk about efficiency, my definition of efficiency is quite simple from a business perspective. It's about doing more with less. So every year on year, our budget that we need to be, or the budget that we have to spend, minimizes, yet what we want to achieve increases. So what we've got is in many cases where budgets are being slashed or kept constant, but the achievement of a business goal or something out there that we want to achieve really, is being stretched to a large extent. What does that mean? Is that how do we reduce cost or we grow revenue? That's the only two parts of this financial equation that we can really play around with. And so we're seeing that artificial intelligence can, to a large extent, really drive the cost-saving component quite well. And I don't want to scare people because this is something that's also very much misunderstood. is that our robots going to be able to take over our jobs? And one of the most easiest places, the places that you and I see, where we see from a cost savings perspective, from a business lens specifically, is you and I as costs. Now, when I say you and I are costs, we draw a salary, whether the salary is paid weekly, every second week, or once a month, is that we have a cost associated to the business. And then we also have the business saying, listen, I can only rely on Manoj, as an example, for 8 hours of the day, because that's what the labor laws state as an example, is that you also need to give him 1 day of the week off, an hour in the day to go and have lunch. So think about that now, Martin. If we think about the cost saving, is that the ability to say, okay, how can I automate some of what Manoj is doing? Now, I just want us to be very clear. It's less about automating my entire job function, but automating components of my job function. In other words, I, for one, would love for artificial intelligence to get to a stage where my emails would be responded to and then flagged for me to follow up if it needs any other actions. But really, automatic answering of my emails in the same manner that I would have answered them or responded to you, as an example, Martin. So there's no delay there. But the real cost saving comes from the efficiency. If we think about it from a human perspective, back to my 8 hours a day with 1 hour for lunch, is that Manoj also gets sick. Now, when I'm sick and when I resign from an organization and I go to a new organization, there are costs associated with that. And I'm talking about you and I, because I want to touch some really hard points that we must deal with. Is that there's a cost associated with recruiting someone, there's a cost associated with training someone, and then there's also the cost about maintaining and employing an organization as well. Where artificial intelligence is really helping in this case here is the ability to say, okay, there's certain job functions and certain things within my job that could be done better, but also 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that we don't need Manoj all the time. We can actually allocate time to Manoj to do the value-adding activities. So we're seeing a lot of cost savings come from there because of the efficiency gains that we can get. There's certain things that I don't want to do during the day that takes a lot of time and effort, as an example, but really to gain more efficiency out of me. That's the cost savings that we can see. But we also can see a lot of cost savings coming from the automation of some of our processes. And I say this, to many individuals, is that we must start asking ourselves as individuals, what value do we deliver to our organizations? So every morning, as you look at yourself in the mirror and just before you start getting in front of your computer to start working, we often look at ourselves and say, do I look representable? Which I think is, one valid question in the business world. But the question we should be asking ourselves is, what value am I going to bring to my organization today? And when we ask that value, if we've been doing the same thing every day and doing the same thing over and over again, in other words, taking one piece of, any piece of equipment, in this case, my phone, and just passing it along to something else, what value am I adding in that passing along of that process? And we've got to start thinking about that value, because if it is simply me taking something from A and putting it into B, it would be much better for an organization to save the cost of Manoj and all the nice leave and everything else, but really automate that process. Then there's the other side of cost savings, is the cost of Manoj making a mistake. Every time I make a mistake, there's some intended cost. Whether the cost is direct or indirect, how do we minimize that cost from a business perspective? So I just wanted to touch on that third point there. The fourth there is that many organizations are really moving into what we call complex service offerings. And when we say complex service offerings, we can think about omni-channel as an example. The types of products and services that we got to be able to deliver. Artificial intelligence is really helping us to be able to say, what are the critical things that we need to focus with, and how can we do that quite quickly as well? And then the last one, which is something that you spoke about upfront, is the 5G. Now, the 5G really, from a business perspective, is really taking everything at the edge, the IoT devices. I prefer to call it the Internet of Everything right now. Everything seems to be connected all together. But 5G and 6G, as you were talking about, brings into this critical ecosystem of artificial intelligence for businesses to understand what's happening at the edge. The ability to collect all that data and enable it to come across into, let's call it a central data repository, and then to start making sense of what's really happening out there. So if we think about this from a business perspective, is that what we've got to really start understanding is that artificial intelligence from a business side is to increase efficiency and efficacy. What is AI? It's quite simply an umbrella term for where people are crunching numbers. The ability to, use machine learning, which includes things like supervised and unsupervised learning, the technical capabilities of it. But what is the aim of it at the end of the day? The aim of this artificial intelligence is really starting to come to how do I drive top line growth, bottom line savings. And generally, where we see that occurring in many organizations and many industries specifically is really around, the ability to say, how can I do more with less? And as I talk about that, I think one of the things that we shouldn't be fearful of, just as I talked about us as individuals in AI, is that AI is not going to replace our jobs. And I think we must just start with that basis. The artificial and narrow intelligence that I spoke about is where we are. It may do a component, one or two things in my job better than I could. But the real value is that artificial intelligence and I need to work hand in hand. And I think we've got to look at it from the classic English saying, which says, the glass is either half full or half empty, depending on how you look at it. But the ability to say that the glass is half full, it's half full because what are those basic things that AI can help me with, and what value can I now bring to my job and to the organization? So AI is not going to replace our jobs. It's going to complement our jobs. And I want us to start thinking about artificial intelligence like that. Until we still get to a state, and I think we're probably about maybe even 50 years away still to be in all honesty, to get into artificial general intelligence. I think from a business perspective, we've got to see what are the small things that were only adding 20% of value, but were high cost. The 80-20 principle generally plays out in some for a ratio there. But really about AI really being able to help us get through that 80% high cost, but only delivering 20% value. How do we bring that down? So the ability to really pull that through. But when we start thinking about it, is that we must also understand that artificial intelligence is not new. Martin and everyone that's listening, AI is not new. It's been around since the 1950s at least. And that really came out of what we call the Turing test. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but to understand that it's not new. It's been around. We've just been enabled by the faster processing, the connectivity that we've seen, and the ability now to be able to capture, store, and analyze vast amounts of data that comes in different shapes and different forms. So that for me is really critical to please understand from a business perspective. But the question really is about where are organizations and industries using it? If we really see at the moment, what we know is that from an artificial intelligence perspective, is really there not to create new products and new services, but really to enhance our current products. So often when we think about artificial intelligence, what I often see is people think about how do we create a new product or service out of the AI. That's not where the biggest value is for organizations. It's about enhancing what we currently have. And that's why I spoke about efficiency and efficacy from a business perspective. Then where we're seeing that AI can really add value is on our internal operations. So think of those mundane tasks, those tasks of moving a piece of paper as an example from A to B simply. It's how do we automate that? How do we optimize those processes? And there we start thinking about things like continual improvement all the time. And continual improvement is something that every organization keeps thinking about. How do we become leaner? How do we become faster? How do we deliver a better customer experience? But our internal processes, most of the time, our biggest barriers to being able to deliver externally to our consumers, either in a B2B or a B2C perspective. Then we're also seeing that the benefits of adoption of AI in business is to help us make better decisions. Now, I choose my words very carefully when I talk about decision making. It's less about making the right decision, because I'm a firm believer at the point of making a decision to do something, you're never 100% sure of the outcome. I'm a probabilistic thinker, if everyone can appreciate that. But it's about helping us make better decisions. How do we leverage all of the data that's sitting around there? How do we get some help from the AI to tell us what are some of those major trends that are out there, and how can we craft our business strategies based on the trends that we see in the macro environment? Let's be clear, the world is changing at a faster pace each and every year. We're generating more data each year than was generated in the preceding years before that. So we've got this deluge, we've got so much of data, but what are we really doing about it? Or what are we doing with that data? And the AI is really helping us starting to make sense about that data specifically. And then what we're seeing after making better decisions is that AI really helps us from a business perspective to optimize our external operations. Just think about this, and I think, quite pragmatically, if we've got an entire supply chain, supply chain is made up of various smaller components. It's the ability to track where our constraints in that entire system and how do we optimize those constraints. The ability to optimize around those constraints really helps us deliver operationally a service that is quick, number one, but number two, to expectations of our business users or our consumers to a large extent. But it gives us insights into our supply chain, gives us better predictability. Now, we often don't talk about that from an AI perspective, but it's really about how can we optimize that if I rather hold back for 2 minutes, I may be able to arrive at a place 10 minutes ahead of time. So it's the intelligence that comes in by taking in multiple different data points that really comes in there. So we see that, and then what we see, from the point number 5, from an organizational perspective, is the point that I've said, which is really, and please, it's no priority order, but really where we see AI being used in organizations. It's the ability to free up your employees to do what we call creative work. But I call it rather the value-adding activities. If we think of our organizations and the employees within our organizations, we employ them to add value. In other words, to add intelligence, to bring in their diverse views, the ways they think, and the ability to solve those complex problems. What we've really got to appreciate is AI gives me back something that many of us don't appreciate. It gives me back the gift of time by allowing me to focus on what truly, truly matters to my organization. And that for me is something we don't often think about when we talk about artificial intelligence. Are we seeing it across industries as well from a business perspective? Yes, we are. As you can imagine, I think we've all interacted with it. One of the biggest industries that AI is being looked at or being used in is the retail industry. Now, often what we do from a business perspective is we put ourselves in industry silos. But what I want us to really start thinking about is what can we learn from industries that have led the way? The retail industry. If you're in the retail industry, what can you learn from a parallel industry? But what we've seen is that the retail industry has really led the adoption of artificial intelligence and the use of it. So you would see to a large extent, Amazon Go is a good example of this, where you walk in, you can take what you want off the shelf, put it into your pocket or into a packet, and then you can really, just walk out with it. And that almost happens quite seamlessly. You tag in with your phone through a QR code, and it uses something that, Martin, you mentioned upfront, computer vision, to analyze what has Manoj done and which user has taken what product off the shelf and what have they done with that product. So it's the rapid and the quick analysis of the data from using, what it's seen, what the cameras have seen, to be able to then say, this is how much we've got to charge Manoj as he walks out. Now, if we think about that, that's what we've seen in the retail sector. Many organizations are really now playing in that retail sector to say, how can we better the customer experience? What does it mean for the retail sector, whether in clothing or food or anything like that? How do we deliver a service that's quick? What are the implications? If I go to a grocery store, I can tell you now, Martin, many people, if they've got to spend more than 10 minutes in a line waiting to pay for something, they might as well just leave the stuff. They get frustrated, and it really damages, the customer experience around that. So we've seen that coming out of the retail sector specifically, that's rapidly followed by something you and I can appreciate here, technology, communications, and entertainment. Entertainment, as we all know, we think about Netflix as an example. You're really using the AI and the machine learning to be able to really produce and show you sort of what movies or shows you should be watching next based on what you've watched before that. That's all being automatically generated. It's the algorithms that are being used to see what does Manoj often watch, and then really, start recommending to him what other movies he could be seeing. And we saw that Amazon was one of the first companies, not the first, but one of the first to really do that. And then we're seeing it really enter into financial services as well. Now, financial services, and I think we mustn't talk about it too much at a broad level, but we must get into the components of it. Insurance. When we talk about financial service, that includes insurance, whether in a B2B or a B2C setting. It includes the banking that you and I do on a daily basis, transactional banking. So if we just take those two components, what we're seeing is that artificial intelligence is really adding value to what do people really start thinking and using their money for. So we've seen this in the financial services industry, and more specifically now, more recently in the healthcare industry. In the healthcare industry, we're starting to see this massive. When I say it's becoming big in the healthcare industry, how do we wade through lots of data to be able to start understanding, how do we diagnose pre-cancer as an example? When someone is way ahead, we can give them a preventative care, and the ability to say that someone may be, getting into maybe contracting cancer, if that's the right terminology. So we're seeing this come out of different industries and being applied. But where are they really being applied? And I think, if we think about the industries, and let's just focus on the telco industry, specifically or the telecoms industry, we're seeing that artificial intelligence is within the service operations industry, internal service operations, specifically in the telco industry. So in other words, how do we get our services better? Then we're starting to see it's about product and service development, or firstly, enhancing our current products or services. Then we're seeing it being used in marketing and sales in the telecoms industry. In the financial services industry, where we're seeing AI being used is around risk. Now, this is something I'm going to touch on shortly, but I think it's something that we've got to now be alert to a large extent. But when we see in financial services, AI is being looked from being used really from a risk mitigation perspective. Then we're starting to see it being used also from a service operations perspective as well. If we think about the automotive industry, I'll go into automotive quickly, but we're really seeing it there from the manufacturing side. So automotive industry, specifically from an assembly perspective, we know the assembly line, and I spoke about this from a value chain perspective earlier, but really about how do we leverage what we know about our assembly line, what we know about our service, our supply chain. How do we be able to get better insights into it by taking in multiple data points all together? So practically, we are seeing this play out. It is reducing cost and it is increasing revenue. So how do we see this? In marketing and sales specifically, we're seeing that it is certainly cutting a lot of cost and increasing revenue. Think of personalized, marketing adverts that you and I may get. I visit a website and all of a sudden, I get emails if I've signed up, and we know that there's regulation around that. But it's being able to allow marketing, instead of spraying and praying, but to be very pertinent to say who is or what type of product will Manoj buy. So it's really personalized to me to a large extent as well. And then we're seeing that personalization is not about spraying and praying and getting marginal hit rates, if I can call it that, from a marketing perspective, but being really pinpointed quite quickly to say how much money do I need to spend, the cost of acquisition of Manoj as a consumer. Then we're also seeing it from an HR perspective, the ability to say, and I'm going to start touching on this slightly, who's the right type of people by scanning multiple data points about individuals, about are they the right individual for our organization in HR as well. But in HR, we often think about, bias specifically, and we'll talk about bias just now, but we often talk about the bias, but the AI that I'm talking about here is not just in the recruitment of it. It's also about employee retention, and I think sometimes we forget about that. The ability to use artificial intelligence, its components, machine learning, neural networks, how Manoj is behaving as an employee, to see when is there a probability that Manoj may want to leave his organization. And when he's on that route and you really want to retain me, the ability to be proactive in being able to retain someone like myself in that case there. So we're seeing that happening. We're seeing this, if I talk about the telco industry quickly, and then I'll touch on consumer packaged goods or even retail. What specific applications of AI is being used? In the telecoms industry, we see it from a machine learning. How do we crunch and learn from the patterns of data that come out of it? But specifically in the telecoms industry, what we're seeing is virtual agents or conversational interfaces. That's where we're really seeing the artificial intelligence being used. In other words, where people are now really interacting with a bot, as an example, a chat bot, or the ability to have voice commands to be able to resolve queries quite quickly. That's where we're seeing it predominantly used in the telecoms industry, and then also around natural language text understanding. What is that? All of us have to some extent been able to already interact with this. I'm a huge fan, and I say this with no qualms, but really about talking to my phone, even if there's no one else listening on the other side. But me having a conversation with something like Siri or Bixby, if you're an Android user specifically, what we don't appreciate is the nuances that come up. A few years ago, as an example, if I wanted to know, who is the president's wife in any country, I would have to ask Siri, hey Siri. Siri would say, yes, how can I help you? I would have to say, who is X's wife in the country, the president's wife, as an example. Siri would return an answer to me. I could then have to ask, what is Y, the wife's name? What is her age or his age, whatever it may be? And in that case, it was clear statements that had to be there. What we can now ask from, when we think about artificial intelligence and conversational bots, is the nuance of really having a conversation with a Siri or a Bixby. It's like asking, who is the president of South Africa? And then who is his wife? And I think we don't often understand that nuance. It's a conversation that you and I have. It's got some contextual intelligence around it. And so the ability to not only state statements, but have a conversation, yes, with the robot in many cases that many might feel unnatural, but really ability to say, how can I have this conversation with something that will give me an answer to what I want? So then we see that happening out, predominantly in the telecoms industry, and then computer vision. Now, computer vision is being used from a maintenance of towers perspective to make sure that, what we're seeing on the towers, what's really happening from a predictive maintenance perspective there. And I spoke about computer vision being used in the retail sector, but really pioneered by Amazon Retail, or Amazon Go, as the brand is often called there. If I think about consumer packaged goods, we're really seeing physical robots. Now, this is something that many of us are thinking is going to take over the world. But what we're seeing from a consumer packaged goods perspective is the real application of this here is that you've got the robots being able to package the shelves, as you can see. In other words, maintaining optimal levels of stock on a shelf, being able to, in real time, feed back to another machine, as an example, manned by or looked after by a human, to say, we're running low on stock X, Y, and Z, and we need to start really, stocking up the shelves, because that really boils down to what we can get out of there. So we see that really playing out, and there's multiple uses of it. And we're seeing this used differentially across, many, many different industries. I want to talk just lastly around the part here, Martin, before we come back, just around this whole point about, are humans going to lose their jobs? So, Martin, you and I are still going to be needed, and everyone else is on the call that's going to be needed. But there's a big but to it, is that for us to be able to add value to our organizations, what we will need to do is change our skill sets. It's the ability to learn what are those new skills. I mentioned, I've got 3 kids, and my kids are 11, 8, and 6 years old. How I learned was I went to a physical library. I had to look, where's this book? And many of us had the same knowledge if it all came from the encyclopedia. Now, within seconds, sitting in the comfort of their home, if you've got connectivity to the internet, you just Google it, right? And it's become a verb, but you can find it. What is the skill that you need now? Is not the searching skill. It's the skill to say what is fluff, fake news, if I can call it that, and what's real. So the ability to discern what's really, what I'm being bombarded with and what makes sense to me now. So one of the critical things is that we're not going to be replaced. We've got to think about artificial intelligence as complementary. That for me is really critical. But the onus also sits on you and I, Martin, and everyone else on this call. What are some of those new skills? And I say this as I loop back to where Martin asked me, what's my background? And I said I ended up where I ended up serendipitously. It was me wanting to learn and be curious all the time in learning new skills that's really got me there. Yes, I had a base set of skills. I had the ingredients, the flour. Remember, I talked about baking a cake, which is the data in an organizational sense. I had that, but it's the ability to continually learn, the ability to say, yes, I was wrong, or yes, I was right, and somewhere in between, but the ability to really keep learning. And therefore, what we've got to do and think about from an organization perspective is, from a 5 to 10 year period, what are those critical skills that are required to keep our organizations competitive, number one, but number two, our employees that are needed. We can't replace, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which side you look at it, human beings. And I think, Martin, I've given quite a high level of that there. And I hope, I haven't spoken too fast. But really, there is definitely a place.
Been very
Businesses can
interesting.
definitely get a competitive advantage out of it.
Yeah. No, thank you for all this. And I didn't come up here to interrupt you. We are nearing the end of the hour, though. So at some point we need to stop. I've been listening, and I have some questions. There was a question that came in from David, who asked us if you could elaborate on the difference between narrow and general machine learning, and maybe compared to narrow general AI. I have some
Yeah.
thoughts that dovetail on that, but could you start off by saying something on that?
Yeah, so I think, let's, because I split it out quite nicely to say there's artificial narrow intelligence. So narrow intelligence is just that. And I think, David, it's such a great question, because that's how we apply it in our organizations as well. So artificial narrow intelligence is quite simply thinking where we've done quite a bit of progress, but it's the self-driving car. It's the intelligent web search. When you start typing the first few letters into a Google search bar, as an example, it gives you, what you may be looking at. It's being used in a very narrow perspective. the ability to say it can do one thing and one thing only. And the reason I say that that's what narrow intelligence is because it can only do that very narrow piece of work and an intelligence from a machine learning perspective. Let's be very clear. To be able to design and get a self-driving car really working to a high level of accuracy takes a lot of human intervention. What is that and what does it mean? Is that we've got to get millions, if not billions, of photos of cars and what they may interact with as they're driving down. And then we've got to start training our computer systems that when you see something that looks like a dog, looks like a cat, it needs to stop. But how do we teach those computer systems to do that? David, it's you and I, and there's actually websites out there that people get paid to do this, is to actually tag dogs and cats on a physical picture that's being shown to them. And that's how the machine learns. Oh, that's how a dog looks. And here's some variations of that dog as an example, or a cat or a human being. Here are the variations. So when anything looks like that, I've got to take some action. It all works on the basic principle of if I see something else and I can't classify it, I may leave it. And so that narrow intelligence is I know how to look at a dog, a cat, a human, and possibly a traffic light, as we call it, or other cars. Very narrow in its application. So artificial narrow intelligence, also in the organizational sense, what we see is that you don't see it being operating or impacting an organization or an entire organization horizontally. We see AI being used very specifically in specific verticals, such as sales and marketing, as an example. And we see that because we haven't been able to get the general intelligence that you and I have, David, to be able to apply it through multiple different verticals in an organization and multiple different scenarios as you and I may be driving a car. And so that's narrow intelligence. It's quite literal in its meaning, is that even though we think about it as being complex, it's just got a very narrow application. I cannot, unfortunately, if we think of the code as a human being, copy and paste that code to fly an aeroplane. Two completely different scenarios. Yet a human, a pilot, can drive a car as well as fly an aeroplane. And that's what we term general intelligence, where we've made very little to no progress at the moment. So general intelligence is being able to do anything you and I can do, and in any shape or form. In other words, David, you and I can have a conversation about the weather now. 2 minutes later, we can have a conversation about flying an aeroplane. 3 minutes later, we can have a conversation about something completely else. However, where we sit from an AI perspective, you can't do that. You need different systems to be built for each and every one of those different pieces there. Now, that's what really drives it at the end of the day. I hope that's clear there, Martin.
Thanks. I thought it was. That question made me think. I mean, I'm coming in as a normal layperson, the man on the street, as they say, looking at this, and I've read all the SF novels and articles, and I wonder about that question. You had the narrow AI and then the general AI. So I would like to hear your thoughts very briefly. You're the expert here on the super AI and the Kurzweil singularity. Will we be eradicated, and will the world be taken over by
So Martin, you're
AI?
touching on. I think you're touching on a point that is it possible? I think everything is possible. Let's just be clear about that, right? But I don't think it's going to ever get to that stage. I think we centuries away. I think it's going to be very difficult to get there because one of the things that we've got to think about when we talk about super AI is quite simply around the ethics around it. We've got to think around the morality of being able to do this because essentially what you're arguing for, or what we're arguing for, is the death of a species, and that species just so happens to be us. And often in the business term we talk about it. When you kill your own products. There's a business term. It's just slipped out of my head right now.
Kill your
But
darlings.
Apple did it. Yeah, when you kill your own product because it's got a better thing. So what we're doing is killing our own individuals. I don't think we'll get to super AI. I think that's still very far away. I think we're gonna be very. It won't happen in our lifetime. I can assure you of that, Martin. I think we're barely getting artificial narrow intelligence
Right.
100% right. Then to move it into general and then to move it into super is far too far. And I
Can I
don't think
just
we
add
get there.
just like a little spin on that, and then move on? But just still is sort of in the science fiction area
Yeah.
era. Still, without even going to super. I mean, general is thought of as being like you and me, being like
Yeah.
humans. So does the concept of consciousness ever enter into your work or your, because I mean, it
Yeah.
really has repercussions on ethics, of course, if I
Yeah.
create something that maybe feels things.
Yeah. So I think, it's the consciousness part is how does something self-learn, right? So you and I can self-learn to a large extent. So we must always remember is that there's always a human that's programming the AI to learn and do things in a certain way, which then, starts saying, is it ever going to come to life? No, it can't come to life unless you've programmed it to be able to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to operate like you and I, which I think is virtually impossible. And
Okay.
I'm going to stand on that. And the reason I'm saying that, Martin, I think is important, is the ability to make it live like you and I means that we've got to have the ability to aggregate different data sources. And then we've got to have one of the big five problems when we talk about AI ethics specifically is the explainability problem. Explainability is one of the biggest problems we have in artificial intelligence. When a computer makes a decision, how do we explain, in a court of law as an example, how did that robot make that decision? I can interrogate you, you can interrogate me on how I've made that decision.
Hmm.
You can't do that so simply. The explainability problem is the issue. And then you've got the people who are actually feeding this the data. That's what it boils down to. Martin, too
Interesting,
many science
interesting.
fiction
Thank you. I,
movies.
I, I won't take more time with that, but
Yeah.
I've never thought about that, but I can really imagine that coming into play with self-driving cars if there are incidents and you need to explain things. When I read about 6G, a lot of the talk about AI has been in the context of precognition. They even make sort of parallels to like the film Minority Report, where you have the precogs that live constantly in the near future, and that AI could be used to maybe avert incidents in traffic, for instance,
Yeah.
actually being able to see this whole. So this precognition is something that is often close to AI. Is that a reasonable connection, do you think? Because lots of things in 6G are very vague and hazy and very salesy, so to speak. So this may
So,
very well also be. Do you think it's reasonable that AI will be used
yeah.
for precognition?
Yeah, so I think we're calling it precognition now. That's just called predictive analytics, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
But
it's the ability.
on a very precise level, I suppose.
Yeah,
Being,
yeah.
yeah.
So I think one of the key things here is it all works on a probability, and the more data you have, and the more breadth of data you have, which 6G, 5G enables me to get different types of data in, it does come to a level that's more accurate than I would have had any other previous time. So that does help, right? But it's about predicting somewhat of an uncertain future. And if we think about the analogy right now, is like I mentioned while I was talking, is that I'm a probabilistic thinker. A global pandemic such as coronavirus is not an impossible event. It's just highly improbable. And
Mm.
that is what artificial intelligence and what you're talking about right now is all about. How do I take in more data points to possibly predict the future with a greater level of accuracy?
Right.
That's what it
I
boils down to.
This is fascinating. Uh, on the next installment in this series, you're going to talk about ethical AI, right? So
Yeah.
this has a lot to do with what we're talking about right now. That's
So,
coming up in June. So let's see what the date is for that. Um, 15th of June is the date for the next installment, which is ethical AI. So you're very welcome to join us then. Listen to Manoj Chiba talk about that. If you want to check out our training portfolio, we're APIS Training. You can look at apistraining.com. We have the AI course with Manoj, which is AI for telecoms, which is specifically for telecommunications corporations. And with that, I think, do you have any closing words for today, Manoj?
yeah. Embrace it. The future is here. It's not it's not next year, it's not the year afterwards. Embrace it. Let's learn to learn. And I think this is a fascinating space that has impact for us as individuals and the organizations that we serve.
Wow. Perfect words. So take care, everyone. Thank you so much, Manoj, for being here today.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone who's listening. And we'll see you on the next webinar on ethical AI. Take care out there. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.